The third in our new monthly series of WebEx lectures that we call the Seleukid Lecture Series. This has grown organically from the Seleukid Study Day conferences that began some 10 years ago in Exeter. There have been seven very successful conferences. To show you where things are, the conference volumes for Study Days 6 and 7 are now in preparation. Altay and I spoke at the first of these online lectures, and our friend Richard Wenghofer spoke last month. We are very interested in your proposals for the fall and winter series. Remember that you can offer works in progress, and we're very happy to offer constructive suggestions and feedback and bibliography. And we are going to begin now recording this conference, so everybody should know that. So I turn it back to Altay.
Well, I would like to echo Ben's welcome to all participants, and I have a few introductory notes on our speakers today, starting with Mariah Lord, our first speaker. She took a master's degree in ancient history at the University of Wales, Trinity St. David in Wales, and is now working on a PhD on the Seleucid border with Kyle Erickson and Katharina Zinn. At the same time, she is a lecturer in writing and communication at Module University in Vienna in Austria. She actually has a very colorful and distinguished CV. So many of her stations, and I think her first passion in life is music in all its diversity. And so she has done field work throughout Eurasia, published in many distinguished with many distinguished presses and various university degrees in the field. And I only want to point out that some of her field work took her as far as India, and we will see the very broad perspective also in her research on the Seleucids. Her talk will be entitled "The Futility of the Search for Lines." Before she takes on, I will, oops, something has disappeared on my screen. That's the wrong one. I will briefly also introduce the other speakers. So now I have messed things up. Oops. Here we go. Deirdre Klokow is our second speaker, and she is currently a PhD candidate and provost fellow at the University of Southern California, with Christelle Fischer-Beauvais being her supervisor. She has formerly gained a BA degree at Columbia University, studying with Professor John Ma. And she has a very distinguished interest also in mapping and GIS mapping technology. I mentioned that particularly because I know that many of the participants are also very much interested in, well, not only in spatial history, but also in mapping technology. So I hope that there will be a lot of networking also after this presentation. Well, the distinction of Deirdre's studies so far can also be seen by the fact that she will be a fellow at Paris-Nanterre and Paris-Sorbonne next year. I had the pleasure to read previous drafts of both Deirdre and Mariah, and I was really impressed not only by the level of scholarship and by the originality, but also by the beauty of their style. I really envy them. I have not yet achieved that even with my 50+ years. But this is something, together with their interest in geography, that connects them with our correspondent, our expert correspondent, Professor Paul Kosmin from Harvard University. He is normally, well, I would normally expect that he is well known in Seleucid circles, but I still would like to point at least to his two main contributions to the field. Most of all, his book, The Land of the Elephant Kings. So this is also the main reason why we have invited him, because he is the best to respond to ideas of spatial concepts in the Seleucid world. although I don't want to fail to manage that soon thereafter, his book On Time in the Seleucid Empire and its constructions is the second leg of his marvelous study of the ideological conception of the Seleucid Empire. Many more books, co-edited books, have appeared recently. I mentioned the 2 volumes co-edited with Andrea Berlin, The Spare Won Land, Sardis from the King's Peace to the Peace of Apamea in 2019, and most recently, earlier this year, The Middle Maccabees from the Death of Judas through the Reign of John Hyrcanus. And besides many others of his projects, I mentioned that he is working on a monographic project on the ancient Greek coastline. So without further ado, I pass on the floor to Mariah.
Okay, good. Thank you very much. Hopefully you can hear me and see my screen. Is that right? You can see the application? Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. Right. Well, I will start then. Okay. I'd like to begin by saying what I'm about to present today is very much work in progress. So I'm really at the very beginning of writing my PhD. So obviously, any comments, any insights, they're really welcome and really helpful. There is something rather paradoxical, I think, about the paper I'm about to give. So while I will argue that conceiving of the Seleucid Empire as having a border is ahistorical, the fact that I'm writing about this very much reflects the concerns of the contemporary world. And I suppose it could be argued that the selection of this as an area of investigation has really something of the ahistorical to it. And in order to understand why I think this is something that requires us to think again about how we conceive of territory occupied by the Seleucids, I'd like to give you a little bit of background. I'd like you to know where this came from. So the international border, really seen through contemporary Western eyes, is a fact. Okay, over the last 10 years or so, I've been living in Austria for about 11 years now. So as a British citizen in Austria, the concept of borders has loomed increasingly large in my life. In Europe and North America, political and cultural discourses over borders have become extremely fraught. So in 2015, I was eyewitness to the arrival of people fleeing across the Austrian border from conflicts in Syria and elsewhere, and of course to the resulting moral panic about the arrival of the other. Then in 2016, there was the Brexit vote, which began the process of erecting a border between the United Kingdom and its nearest neighbours, and made my own status that of a third country national in my adopted home. In the same year, the presidential election in the United States saw people chanting, "Build the wall." And politics subsequently in Europe turned to the far right, and there was a push that we're still seeing towards ethnic nationalisms predicated on discrete populations within apparently natural and sometimes contested borders. We've seen the erection of a fortress Europe through intimidating infrastructure, using razor wire and fences to the east largely, and physical attacks on those seeking to pass into the EU by state forces. At the same time as all of this was happening, I began an MRes in ancient history at the University of Wales. And as I began to study, I realized that my interests were pushing me towards the Hellenistic world. And as I began to explore the literature, I came across the book, which Altay has already mentioned, The Land of the Elephant Kings by Paul Kosmin. Now, I've always been drawn towards ideas of space and geography, and I was fascinated by this account of how ideas of territory were created by the Seleucids. Now, it's a truism that we write history through the concerns of our own times, and this is for a good reason. It's one way we work through ideas to help us understand the contemporary world, and perhaps more contentiously, it helps us invent the myths and traditions that underpin the idea of nationhood. My contention here, however, is that our present conception of the border, something really born out of the nationalist and imperial projects of the 19th century, and applied retrospectively, largely in classical scholarship, has clouded our view of how territory was seen by populations in specifically the Seleucid world, and perhaps more widely. So in order to start looking at that specifically, I'd like to show you 4 quotes. So you can see here, there's one from Sherwin, White and Court, their famous Sardis de Samarkand book. There's one from Austin, from the, I think it's from the Companion to the Hellenistic World. There's the Rousset I love, it's from the Encyclopedia of Ancient History, where the head word is frontiers, and he immediately starts talking about borders. And then Paul Kosmin's book, from 2014, where we see border, frontier, and boundary all within a paragraph. So this paper argues that Seleucid territory was not delineated by a system of borders. And furthermore, the search for these is futile. It was rather experienced and conceived of as a series of spaces through which people moved. And it was this movement that gave them coherence. This implies that the Seleucid Empire was far less unified or centralized than some models have claimed. And so power and control over territory was contingent, not primarily driven by an overarching ideology or administrative system, nor was it necessarily beholden to an elite inheritance over the longue durée. Adopting this stance may make it possible to move away from what have been two dominant, if differing, views of the Seleucid Empire, either that it was a Hellenizing mission of a weak and remote elite, or that the Seleucid world was largely one of inherited ideas and structures. Now, defining the meaning of border is really problematic, even within a contemporary context, when it might be imagined that all of us here have a very clear idea of what it might comprise. That is, a clear line, a delineation enforced by militias or infrastructure, a political division. However, this is not necessarily so. And you can see here this quote from Cooper and Tinning, that they're talking about the contemporary border here. It's not just neatly tessellating territorial outer edges of nation states. They're not limit lines. But for the ancient world, the problem defining them is compounded by the distance of time and the nature, and particularly with the Seleucid world, of the sources. Dictionary definitions are deeply unhelpful. So if we look here, we've got the Oxford English Dictionary. But in an archaeological context, Foyer has distinguished between three different terms: the boundary, the border, and the frontier. And it is these definitions really that underpin how I'm going to discuss the idea of border and boundary and frontier from now on. So you can see here, border is from a core zone to the limits of effective political control. Boundaries are lines, and frontier lies beyond the border or the border zone. In addition to this, he notes that borders can also be seen as outward-looking, fluid and porous, liminal and or transitional zones, which encourage innovation and change. But I have a slight problem with this. Liminality is how the border is seen from the center. This is the border seen from the central and elite position of power. Well, for those who experience and live in the zone, it is absolutely the norm. In addition, people exist on both sides of and across a border, and as such it is not perceived nor created by just one side. The inside and outside of the idea of a border, the us and the other, is just the type of structural binary that Darnero warns us cannot always describe cultural practice or practices. And although the contemporary conception of a border may appear at times to be analogous to that of a boundary, following Foyer's definition, it should not really be seen in the same light. Boundaries can subvert the idea of border. They can exist between demographics, topographies, or societies, and they may not coincide with, and they can transgress borders. The ideology of borders may also be subverted by territory, which lies within a claimed sphere of power, but comprises areas of ineffective political control. So again, that conflicts with Foyer's definition. In addition, as borders derive from state ideology, they are not something which can always be readily identified. Borders are political, they are not natural things. And borders are invisible unless we make them manifest, unless we give them built infrastructure. Where this physical infrastructure does not exist or cannot be seen through written ideology, as it is argued here for the Seleukid Empire, the political border cannot be said to exist. So vagueness and confusion over terminology seems to be a feature of writing which specifically addresses the concept of delineation in the classical Greek world and later. And in an overview of the ancient Greek border, Daverio Rocchi, who is the person who has written perhaps the most on this, describes a natural and flexible border corridor in liminal areas on the outmost fringes of the territory inhabited by the Greeks. Okay, so we have this liminal area on the outside of Greek territory, outside of this Greek population. However, within that, Thermopylae acts as a boundary between Hellas and the outside, and also as a sacred frontier demarcating the space of Hellenic religiousness. However, at the same time, she of course acknowledges that a great deal of the Greek world lies beyond Thermopylae. So here, border must lie beyond the boundary. But if so, this delineation here cannot truly be seen as the divide between Greece and what lies beyond, while a frontier is seen as something lying beyond effective political control, but can be seen as a demarcation and corresponding with a boundary. So I feel here there's a great deal of confusion about what actually she is trying to describe. Now, boundaries of some kind do seem to have been acknowledged, of course, and to take one example of an ancient source, Pausanias makes numerous references to divisions between territories and markers of divisions, but also the difficulty of determining where they lie. So here he gives an example of the Lacedaemonian, sorry, I'm going to trip over myself here, but the borders of the Argives and the Tigate, which is there in, but below, he says, it's impossible to say where this border lies. Where is it possible to discover the truth between these boundaries? He does say, however, that a sense of border does correspond to his conception of a city, even if the city in question does not correspond to his ideal. When describing the Phocian city of Panopeus, he notes that it has no government offices, no gymnasium, no theatre, no marketplace, and no water descending to a fountain, all things he seems to think should be part of a city, but acknowledges that its inhabitants do have boundaries with their neighbours and even send delegates to the assembly. This difficulty, however, that he refers to in determining exactly where a boundary lies is also something commented on by Strabo when discussing the disputes between districts and districts within Athens, and you can see the example there. So within the ancient sources, there is an acknowledgement of boundary, but also an acknowledgement of almost the impossibility sometimes of saying where that lies. One of the few references to bring this up to, the time of the Seleucids that we have to a Western delineation of Seleukid space comes from an inscription discovered at Pergamum, though possibly it originates from either Athens or Antioch. And this mentions Antiochus IV being accompanied as far as the frontiers of his own kingdom. And here the genitive plural arion has been translated as frontiers, although this could also be limits, boundaries, or perhaps, I would say more tellingly, territories. There is no mention of his crossing a border. This could simply have been a movement into space, i.e. into territory to which he was laying claim, although this has been called a border coronation. And this was then followed by a series of coronations in coastal cities between 153, 152 and 69 BCE, leading to the claim that this ritual marked the border of the Seleukid realm between land and sea, in the same way that contemporary border rituals, I suppose the rituals of passing through customs, showing your passport, etc., give a sense of passing from one space to another. However, whether the waters of the Mediterranean did mark an end to political space and form a barrier to the passage of goods and peoples is also questionable. Generally, in the ancient world, travel by water was considerably faster than by land. And on the slide here, you can see a table where you can see relative times. You can see Herodotus talking about the difference between Sardis, talking about the distance from Sardis to Susa, and it taking 90 days. By Courier, which is obviously an exceptional case for the Achaemenid period, Graf says it could be down to 7 to 14 days, but that's not the speed people would normally travel at. If you then look at the distance between Sardis and Dura Europos, then you can see it would take 34 to 35 days by road. But if even only part of that was taken by sea, it drops to 25 to 26 days. And you can see the examples going down, where each time there's a sea journey, it is much quicker. And the sea, I think, can be seen very much in terms of the modern Autobahn system, possibly. There's a wonderful example from Blair's recent book on building Anglo-Saxon England, where he talks about the North Sea really as being the sort of motorway of the Anglo-Saxon world, and where the island of Bornholm is considerably closer to ports on the east coast of England than getting to York by land. It takes far less time, and there's a wonderful map where he shows all the connections between those. So the other thing we might want to consider is that sea boundaries don't necessarily constitute border, or don't constitute any sort of hindrance to the passage of people or goods. So that's at the western end of Seleucid territory. But if we move to the eastern end of Seleucid territory, there's not a distinction between land and sea, but rather a question of the distinction between those areas claimed by the Seleucids and those by the Mauryas. Now, both Capdetri and Kosmin identify a border in the east fixed by the so-called Treaty of the Indus. Okay. Now, and Kosmin describes this as a momentous and foundational act of the New World Order. Now, for me, this is a claim which I find rather hard to uphold on the slender evidence of three sources. And these are the three sources here. In Appian, which is really the major source there, the verb used is syntith. I'm going to trip over myself again. Syntithemi, in this context, to agree or conclude, which I think is susceptible of a wider interpretation than conclude a treaty. It is just an agreement. Whether this is anything as official as a treaty, I'm still slightly dubious about. And I think when we look at this a bit further on, then you'll see why. It's at least conceivable, I think, that this was a vague gloss put on a rather unsuccessful expedition. Strabo contributes the information that Seleucus ceded lands to the west of Indus as part of the deal for intermarriage, and also received 500 elephants, as you can see there. Well, the only other mention of these events is by Pompeius Trogus, which of course comes from the epitome which we know by Justin. So that's the sources that we know of that talk about this. And that's seen very much from the West, I would say. There's an Indian view of this deal, which is given by Romila Thapa, who notes that this brought this area with brought the lines of control and of communication in present-day Eastern Afghanistan, Balochistan, and Makran within the sphere of the Mauryas, which is really hardly a Seleukid victory if the purpose of the treaty was to consolidate the easternmost border of the empire. And Capdetri also notes that the ceding of so much territory cast doubt on the degree of the Seleukid incursion into Mauryan space anyway, so whether they actually crossed the Indus. It's also, I would argue, highly unlikely that Seleucus would give up territory which was under his control. Even in the light of a defeat to the east of the Indus would then constitute a defensive line to which he could withdraw if the west banks of the river were his. So this suggests that the reports of Seleucid control of land up to the Indus were merely propaganda to uphold a claim of his being the heir to Alexander. Thapa also notes that in contrast to Appian, referring to a marriage between Chandragupta Maurya and a relative of Seleucus, this intermarriage could just as likely have referred to alliances between Greeks and Indians in the region, a move which merges rather than delineates the two peoples. So as well as it being doubtful that Appian and Strabo give us proof of a border or a treaty, there is little clarity to what is being described. So to give an example, within the space of 2 pages, Paul Kosmin refers to it as a delimitation, or an intermediate zone. The Seleucid Empire's eastern frontier, the boundary of Seleucid power and sovereign claims, the eastern boundary of Alexander's conquests, and the border. So I'd like to know which of those it actually is. Strabo also tells us that India was and is bounded on the west by the Indus. However, also according to him and contradicting himself, the Mauryan state received considerable territory to the west of the river. So for the early Seleucids, there appears to be no identifiable and fixed line to the east, let alone one which corresponded to a natural boundary. Now, this ceding of territory, if the region to the west of the Indus was ever truly held by the Seleucids, does, however, give coherence to a landscape controlled by the Mauryas. Now, rivers tend not to act as a line to divide one territory from another, at least in the ancient world, but they form wider spaces along and on which societies locate themselves. This is true whether we're talking of the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, or, as here, the Indus. And you can see a map here of the drainage basin of the Indus, and you can see it forms a coherent whole. Rivers run through valleys and over floodplains, forming a geographical totality. And within that, they provide a means of transport, facilitating movement and trade. There is a further issue with large rivers, with large floodplains, when trying to identify them as boundaries. As you can see here, I hope. They braid into numerous channels, are fed by numerous tributaries, and move. Returning to Strabo and his description of the Indus, he informs us that its floodplain was littered with abandoned cities and villages because the river had abandoned its proper bed and turned aside into the other bed on the left that was much deeper. So I would say here we have an area which in itself is a coherent whole, but does not necessarily form a line within itself, because where would you draw that line anyway, due to the nature of this moving and complex river system? Now, we often consider it necessary to try and draw lines around a space before we can see it. But as argued here, this is misguided. Now, the terms most often used when we're trying to delineate the Seleucid space are border, boundary, and frontier. But I think, as we've seen, they are not used with precision nor clarity. And this, when we use them, we assume that the reader will have an implicit understanding of what is meant. It also implies, by the use of those terms, that the Seleucid world must have had a border of some kind, emerging out of what has been described as a desire for line. In contrast, I would claim that far from the border being of paramount importance to the creation of a post-Alexandrian Hellenistic world, it is actually a distraction from understanding the nature of Seleucid space. The search for line appears to be a chimera, the sources being remarkably reticent about the existence of borders, and archaeological evidence, so far as I've found out, is also lacking. This absence in itself is telling, as surely as if the border was a central concern of paramount importance to the rulers of ancient societies, we would expect at least some indication of that in the sources which survive. Given this silence, effectively, for us and the peoples of the empire, the Seleucid border does not and did not exist. And now this does not mean there was no concept of the boundary, but the boundaries operated on micro, local, sacred, and/or conceptual level. So boundaries are a different category, I think. But to see the ancient world in one in which territory was delineated in terms of borders on a macro scale, or to see this indeed as being necessary, I think is misleading. Now, if the peoples of the Seleucid Empire had no identifiable concept of the border, they may well have understood the existence of territory through ideas of space rather than line. And I think this is the core of what I would argue. There is no need for a border if shared or indeed contested ideas of space exist between parties. It's not necessary to have a border or a clear delineation to perceive space. The question of where it ends becomes unimportant, the sense of space being in itself enough to comprehend its existence. And I think, if we could think into situations that we've been in where you can imagine you're in space, but you don't have to see the edges of that. And this gives space it gives it the freedom then to be multi-layered. It can overlap, and it can be given different levels of significance or variations in meaning. I would also argue that concepts of territory and space are always specific and they're always contingent. And these force us to consider the particular circumstances and peoples who construct space, rather than relying on abstract political theorizing to try and find lines where none existed. To equate differences in space with the existence of a clear delineation in terms of line between those spaces assumes that ancient states mirror those of modern Europe, with centralized control and a clear separation or border, if you like, between territories under different rule, whether that are a river or through built fortifications, taken to the extreme, I suppose, with the construction of walls. This idea, unspoken and unwritten, projects back in time a concept which reinforces contemporary preoccupations and a sense of the dominance of the Western nation state. One in which fixed lines delineate its area, patrolled by militias of various forms and reinforced with threatening infrastructure. Such a discourse and the idea that natural features such as rivers formed borders was given support from earlier studies on the limits of the Roman Empire and Republic, conveniently supported by the idea of the limes. Such a borderline was seen as a means of keeping out savage races or barbarians on the other side, an othering of those who existed beyond the limits of the military project of conquest. From the work of Monson in the late 19th and early 20th century onwards, research into the limes became an important part of Roman frontier studies, to the point where the term came to be synonymous with the idea of a defended border. The limes of northwestern Europe were a particular focus of investigation, and such was the prestige given to them that they were inscribed into the UNESCO World Heritage List. The Lower German Rhaetian limes, described as the province's northeastern boundary, have also been proposed as a further site. And the coincidence of this proposed inscription with the increasingly militarized and closed nature of the external EU border, I think, is at the very least suggestive. And the parallels between this idea of the expansion of imperial space to a fixed border and the political ideology of modern European imperial ideas are also not difficult to draw. Indeed, the idea of the limes in 20th century colonial spaces was so natural to the ruling order that studies of them were even given assistance by the military forces of colonial powers. So R.L. Stein, back in the 40s, I think it was given help by the French and British air forces. And these ancient divisions were seen to be so clear and strong that they were held to have contemporary significance, not only to justify the imperial project, but also in explaining current identities and divisions within European states. And Briefs, writing back in 2 big articles back in 1939, even uses the division of within and without the limes in Germany to construct a whole history of the country and its society that moves between form and content, subjectivism and objectivism, soul and law, with, tellingly, the first characteristic in each pair coming from outside the Roman world. In addition to the suspicion that such a view of the ancient world was and is convenient for the use of modern governments, the concept of the limes as a strict border has been questioned from within the discipline of classics itself. A far more nuanced idea of the limes emerged in the wake of Isaac's reassessment of the term. And in describing the Roman frontiers of late antiquity, Graham argues that physical and static delineations only became important towards the end of the empire, even if I'm afraid he's still happy to describe the violation and transgression of the frontier by barbarians. This is not to argue, of course, that limes is a word without meaning for the Roman world, nor that the concept of line that was something that was lacking. However, this general sense of a defended border is sometimes applied falsely to the Roman Republic and Empire. The term limes continues to be associated with line, and elsewhere it seems to be applied ahistorically. For example, Paul Kosmin uses the term limes when making his claim that the Seleucid Empire had a desire for line in Central Asia. However, the Roman experience is one that is perhaps not only the exception for the ancient world, and even then was nuanced, but whose general acceptance distracts us from thinking about the division of space in the Seleucid world in more experimental ways. If, as argued above, the meta-concept of line is something that cannot be demonstrated for the Seleucid Empire, this raises the question of how we can conceive of territory during this period. In order to make sense of this, we need to reconsider how we perceive space in the ancient world. The major body of writing on the Seleucid Empire has dealt with the court and the ruling elite, their ideology and projection of space and power. And the major work to date that specifically addresses the Seleucid understanding of border is one which is predicated on elite perspectives. And of course, this is partly due to or largely due to the nature of the sources. However, instead of seeing space as a consequence of the elite paradigm of conquest and exploitation of territory, what is needed is another way of conceiving of Hellenistic space or spaces founded on the experience, physical and conceptual, of the people who inhabited, used, and moved through them. This requires us to see the spaces of Seleucid rule not through the eyes of the ruling elite, but from the perspective of the peoples who inhabited them. It is the people inhabiting territory who create a sense of space and place for themselves through their habits, actions, movements, thoughts, and beliefs. And overwhelmingly, it was a highly diverse set of local peoples that comprised the populations of the territory claimed by the Seleucid court, not Greeks or ethnic Greeks. There is, in addition, and this is on the slide here, an inherent social contrast between ideas of line and space. Line and delineation are abstract concepts and they're beloved of elites. They use them to express power, ownership, and possession, to show the extent of their wealth expressed through land and the carving up of territory. Space, however, is different. It is constructed, occupied, used, and experienced by people. It is not concerned necessarily with ownership, but with movement, utility, and meaning. So it might be said that line is abstract and elitist, while space is concrete and, if you like, demotic. Now, space takes many conceptual forms. It's often conceived as being political, the area of control, whether consensual or not, and the political often drives an understanding of the geographical conception of space. And however tempting it is to think of geographies as being abstract and quasi-scientific, of course, the practice of writing of and on the earth is intimately connected to discourses of power, delineation, and categorization. Space can also be sacred, that is, inhabited, owned, or shared with deities, and so given form and meaning through its association with the divine. And it also has a sense of existing on the binary opposition of within and without. However, predominantly in the modern world, we think of space from a bird's eye view. We project it onto maps, these two-dimensional planes on which we can draw lines. And we can also see the world from space. This was not, I would argue, how space was seen in the past, but it was experienced hodologically. That is, it was perceived through movement along pathways and a process of change in environment and terrain, not through an abstract sense of delineation. Now, doing away with this concept of the Seleucid border is not necessarily as radical as it might at first appear. At the level of the elite, it has its precedence in the work of scholars who have argued that the successors to Alexander retained a pretension to universal empire, which by its nature stretches to the end of the world with no border. This is in contrast to the view that the post-Alexandrian world is one of a system of states with more or less identifiable, if contested, boundaries. These claims to universal kingship can be traced back to declarations made by Mesopotamian kings in the early second millennium and subsequently adopted by a series of Assyrian Achaemenid rulers. So when Alexander battles Darius III at Gaugamela, this was to decide which of them would have sole and universal rule. And it has been argued that at least it was an aim of the successors that universal rule was what they were aiming for. Now, studies which look at Achaemenid's control of space have tended to be more wary about applying the idea of borders to their territory. Cacciadorian makes a general point that although presented to the contrary, empires have generally not tried to put in place fixed territorially exclusive borders. She points out that the Achaemenids described their territory through lists of place and names of peoples rather than mapping, and the order reflected a sense of moving out from a political center towards spaces with ever more tenuous claims of control, which can be seen here from the Visitun inscription. And this sense of proximity and distance suggests that space was not seen as something that was given a clear delineated edge, but that power and control stretched outwards to cover potentially the entire world. And evidence that Seleukid kings recognized no earthly boundaries come from the Borsippas cylinder. On this, Antiochus I is described as king of the world, with a central locus, but no external limit. And this, of course, can also be seen on the Cyrus cylinder, which proclaims that ruler as a universal ruler. However, on the Borsippas cylinder, in column 2, there's a reference to the god Nabu's scepter setting the boundary between heaven and earth. So there is a clear distinction and delineation between two conceptual worlds that is not made for the concrete geography of empire. Now, I want to finish with a quick look at what is perhaps our most explicit example of the representation of metaspace for what is the central region of Seleukid control. And this is this late Babylonian clay tablet from Sippar, or possibly Borsippa. So this is a map of the world with two concentric circles, between which is the Maratut, the ocean, which we can see here. Within the circles is a central region, which shows Babylon, the horizontal rectangle just above the central hole, and as well as Der, Bit Yakina, and Haban. And the parallel straight lines in the center depict the channel of the Euphrates. And outside the ocean are triangles labeled as Nagu, or regions. The text on the reverse names 8 of these, but only 5 are preserved on the map. Now, this has been interpreted in many ways. Most people have proposed that it represents a bird's eye view of the Babylonian world and describes a cosmology in which there is a real center in opposition to a mythical periphery. However, Horowitz doesn't agree with that entirely, and he has written the longest and most detailed description of the map. And he says that the references to the 4 quadrants of the entire universe and the 4 winds means that the Earth's surface extends for an incomprehensible distance to the north, east, southwest of Babylonia, which is close to Antiochus I's claim of a borderless dominion. But there is an alternative reading which gives more support for the idea of non-delineated space from a hodological rather than a bird's eye perspective. Del Nero proposes that it be seen as an itinerary. And this explains why Babylon is not central to the representation. So the reading starts at the circle at the top left, Haban, and moves anti-clockwise through the inner region to the top, and then moves clockwise through the more distant regions. So this suggests that instead of conceiving of the world in which there are distinctions, delineations between regions, space existed on a continuum from that which was close to that which was distant. And this does not also describe a core and periphery, but space which is moved through progressively without passing borders. And this idea of movement through space as a way of understanding and taking ownership is also, of course, given support by the peripatetic nature of both the Achaemenid and the Seleukid courts. So to finish, there is a tendency to see movement as defining a sense of nationhood by taking place within or across borders, and the imagined difference between the two giving rise to a sense of a delineated nation. One of these movements is seen as challenging or threatening the crossing of borders, while the other is seen as being of another order. However, both are forms of human mobility, and whether migration is across a border from the countryside to the city, they are effectively identical. The imagined danger that movement offers to the idea of the state is linked to an evolutionary ideology, whereby civilized nations have emerged from a chaotic past and are those which have imposed settlement on their populations. And Parker recently argues that the retrospective application of this current ideological obsession makes us see historical space in ways that prioritize clearly defined boundaries and blinds us to the presence of human movement, something he terms the territorial trap. So if the past consisted of much more human movement than is often acknowledged, it may have not contributed to the creation of delineated territory, but precisely the opposite. The degree of movement, whether local or over longer distances, is something that is part of the human condition. Many forms of movement are local and contribute to how people experience the space they inhabit on a day-to-day basis. But movement in the Seleucid Empire also, of course, occurred at elite levels and over wider spaces. This has been argued as one of the ways in which territory was consolidated. But if movement can be seen as something which subverts boundaries, then it was not that this consolidation took place within a system of borders. If Seleucid borders were to have been something that was concrete and identifiable, and of paramount importance, then it is not unreasonable to expect that they would be explicitly referenced in at least some of the sources. Of course, if something is not mentioned in the few surviving sources that we have, it does not mean that it does not exist. However, so far, everything seems to point in the direction of space being defined by movement, rather than the abstract conception of border. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mariah, for this very stimulating presentation. And although I know that many of us would love to engage with you in a discussion right now, the plan is to proceed with Deirdre's presentation, to be followed by Paul's comment before we then open the floor to a discussion. Okay, so Deirdre's presentation that is entitled Connectivity and Rural Spaces in the Seleucid Empire.
All right, good morning.
Sorry, Deirdre, I did something very bad. I wanted to mute myself and I muted you. That was entirely my mistake and I cannot undo it. Can you undo this? Can you just unmute yourself?
I think I did.
Okay, sorry.
Am I unmuted? Yes, okay. No, that's fine. Okay, so good morning, everyone from sunny Los Angeles, where it's morning and we're in the middle of a heat wave. So I'm trying to be mindful of the time, so I just want to briefly mention that my dissertation does deal with actually some of the themes that Mariah was just speaking about, but my focus is a little bit more on economic institutions and the way they interact with physical landscapes. So a little bit more sort of sciencey, I guess you could say. I'm living, you know, as I do in California, where we are really experiencing in a really immediate and sort of horrible way the effects of climate change and fires and heat waves and droughts. Obviously really is informing the way I think about sort of ancient space. So with that said, I just want to briefly thank Altay and Ben for having me here, Mariah for her great paper. I have so many thoughts that I want to think about for that, and to Paul in advance for his response. And also just briefly to my advisor, Christelle Fisher-Beauvais, who I think I'll probably be thanking every day for the rest of my life for all of her help. I think we can all agree that writing a dissertation really takes a village. So the paper that I'm going to present today represents a really early exploration of themes for a dissertation chapter on mobility and connectivity between rural and urban spaces. It focuses on two inscriptions from the life of the Seleucid queen Laodicea, the wife of Antiochus II. And a lot remains to be done in terms of research, in terms of just thinking and exploring on this subject, particularly with regard to the role of religious spaces. But this paper does touch on some of my dissertation's more important themes and ideas, such as vertical exchange between local inhabitants, Seleucid bureaucracy and elites, the use of infrastructure and development to reshape the physical space of the empire, and the way that economic institutions and developments functioned as ties binding disparate regions together into something like a Seleucid whole entity. So just to introduce the text I'm going to be working with, in the fall of 254 BCE, Laodicea purchased famously from her husband the village of Panacome in Hellespontine, Phrygia, together with its lands, its settlements, its tower or house. This is the word baris, which is variously translated by people, and its inhabitants, the Laoi, including those who'd been resident in Panacome but had since relocated. So Laodicea was to receive the income from these properties for the year in which the sale was concluded. She was to pay no royal taxes on it, and she was given permission to attach her new estate to the city of her choice. For me, this text contains hints at local dissatisfaction with the Seleucid regime. the governor of Hellespontine Phrygia was to see that the boundaries of the estate were newly surveyed because some local farmers had gone rogue and dug up one of the boundaries along the royal road in what was maybe an attempt to expand their own land holdings. Although I think you can also read this action as a sort of form of active protest. And then for our other text is in the 230s or possibly the early 240s, and I look forward, Altay, to hearing what you have to say about the date of this text. It's Laodicea again, along with her sons Seleucus II and Antiochus, granted to the citizens of Babylon, Borsippa, and Cutha a stretch of royal lands along the Euphrates River. And this land grant set out in a small cuneiform tablet known today more famously as the Lehman Tablet, records the history and conditions of this gift in the form of a declaration by the chief temple administrator and the council of the Esagil Temple. So briefly, to just sort of describe this text, prior to his death, Antiochus had given lands to his wife and sons, who in turn then gave those lands to these cities for attachment to civic lands. And this land had been part of the royal land, the core of Basilica, having been passed down to Antiochus II from his own father and grandfather, and included arable land from a region that had previously been confiscated by the royal treasury. And the proceeds of the land's harvests were left at the disposal of the new owners of the land, but the tithes from the harvest were granted to the patron temples of each city. And notably, provision is made for the inhabitants of the newly gifted lands to keep their lands and garden plots in perpetuity. I'll come back to that. So, both texts have often been read as further evidence for this fairly well understood Seleukid policy of making use of royal lands to build connections and buy loyalty in the cities of the empire or with powerful individuals. This is the concept of land as currency. Certainly, the primacy of cities in the Seleukid political and economic project can't be overlooked. But I think this emphasis, particularly when we're dealing with Asia Minor on the polis, right? I think that this emphasis can obscure the relationship of the Seleucids with the land of the empire, both in its physical sense as arable, productive territory, forming the sort of economic and nutritive foundation of the imperial space, and with the huge stretches of the population who inhabited these non-urban spaces, and who certainly must have greatly outnumbered the elites that are so prominent in our sources. So we're over here, just to sort of physically orient us. Okay, so to begin with Laodicea's land purchase in the 250s. The estate that Laodicea purchased at Panicome was likely based in an Achaemenid period estate or land parcel taken into Seleucid hands after the conquest. So the boundary lines of this estate, and now I'm sort of keenly aware of my use of the word boundary. Sorry, I don't have time to digest this properly, so I'm going to use boundary, but I want to think more about that. The boundary lines of the estate would have been generated in probably the original Achaemenid deed of possession. So Laodicea is not purchasing just a land parcel, but an entity with a pre-existing political identity in a region where Seleucid authority was frequently contested. So it's likely that the Panicome estate was part of the Basilica Cora, inherited by Antiochus II as part of the royal holdings near the town of Seleucid, which you can see over here. The assumption that Antiochus's sale of the estate is related to his alleged divorce or repudiation of Laodicea on the occasion of his marriage to the Ptolemaic princess Berenike, I think can very safely be set aside. Seleucid polygamy makes no such repudiation necessary, and as far as I know, the evidence for that is all negative anyways. So, but that Antiochus should have felt the need to so publicly transfer ownership of this royal estate to his wife, and it's very public. I mean, the inscription is ordered to be published in the main temples of Ilium, of Samothrace, Ephesus, Didyma, and Sardis. This is big publication, right? Suggests a concern to more fully and publicly integrate the region into the Seleucid space. It would seem that over time, this region had become destabilized in a sense. We see that farmers and inhabitants have begun to move away and land has been left untended. This lack of care and management on the part of the Seleucid overlords seems to have been a frustration to the inhabitants who remained, something that those of us who have landlords, I'm sure, can probably relate to. But this is a danger in a region that's pressed by alternate claims to power. So in response, the multiple and prominent records of the sale effectively Seleucidize this estate, pulling it into the network of Seleucid authority. So most notable for me in this dossier is the need to resurvey the Penacoma estate after the boundary line along the old road had been dug up or plowed by neighboring farmers in an attempt to secure more land for themselves, presumably. This is a really, for me, a rare record of the actions of local inhabitants, but of course provides us frustratingly little in the way of actual detail. But I think the appearance of these farmers, these inhabitants in such a text dealing with royal land intended for widespread publication is kind of surprising. It suggests a startlingly amicable relationship between king and subjects, as well as kind of a familiarity or kind of a casual attitude towards this kind of land appropriation that I think is really interesting, and I want to explore it further. But there's definitely a sense that by their actions, these men, these local inhabitants, are deliberately inserting themselves into the Seleucid negotiation of power and authority in the region. And later, it will be local inhabitants again who will provide the administrator in charge of conducting this new land survey with the course that the boundary and the old road had followed. So this local understanding of the ancient shape of the land and its boundaries really proves its value to the Seleucid overlords. And of the three men who provided the details of the original boundaries of the land and thus the course of this old royal road, two of them bear non-Greek names. And of course, we all know by this point that names are not a clear indicator of ethnicity. But the predominance, I think, of non-Greek names in this group is striking. You can see their names on the slide there. So here we see the local, maybe even the remnants of the pre-conquest population, possibly in this case, engaging in the act of shaping and transcribing the land into its pre-Seleucid configuration. The abstraction of Seleucid sovereignty here reverts to and adopts a pre-conquest form, and place becomes palimpsest. So it was the old Achaemenid royal road system, which you can see on the map here in the middle, this famous sort of royal road that was a section of this road that delineated the Penacoma estate to the north and to the west. And it's this road that had perhaps been allowed to fall into ruin by the Seleucids. Clearly, it's not being kept up all that well if it's going to be dug up and plowed by local farmers, right? And this allowing this stretch of road to fall into ruin, maybe this is deliberate. The Seleucids had, in fact, invested in selectively maintaining much of the Persian network of royal roads, as we can see in the sort of scanty evidence of Seleucid stadia markers. We have one here on the screen. Two have been found in Iran, one at Pasargadae and one near Persepolis, both dated to sort of 330 to 80, this early period. One of these milestones was actually made using a piece of the destroyed parapet of Persepolis, which is, I think, kind of a vicious reminder of Achaemenid downfall, and also a really clear statement of the political importance of these ancient roadways. And another inscription from 3rd century Asia Minor records supplies for a conscript labor force used by the Seleucids, likely in this context, for work on the roads of the region, which demonstrates both the Seleucid use of local labor forces and their investment in construction and maintenance of infrastructure, which is one of the sort of reasons for empires to exist, right? We know that roads represent, in a sense, the lifeblood of empires, particularly ancient empires. They are the arteries along which men and money and communication move. The Seleukid era road network had a long precedent. The Achaemenid royal roads, with its network of guarded stations, was itself an extension of an earlier Neo-Assyrian system of roads in Mesopotamia. So a long, long history of imperial imposition and infrastructure. And we actually see Herodotus mentioning the respect in which the Achaemenid era roads had once been held. He describes that the entire length of the road along which Xerxes had once led his army was neither dug up nor planted by the people, but held in great reverence. Now, taking Herodotus with a hefty pinch of salt, right? But still, whether that reverence was motivated by sort of economic concerns for a useful route, or out of a healthy respect or even fear for the Achaemenid authority that the road represented, by the time of our inscription and the imposition of Seleucid authority, attitudes have clearly changed in this region at least. So to move on to the Lehman Text, several details from this jump out at me. And most notable is this careful designation of the land in question. The lands are distinguished as arable lands in perpetuity. So they're both couched in the idiom of Seleucid eternity and using this language of a perpetuity clause, which is a guarantee of continual, perpetual ownership by means of the repeated phrase, ana unsatu. So the text refers to the land in question as zeru, which means productive land that's considered part of a city's district, despite being actually outside of the walls. So again, we have this sort of interesting border interaction. And it's defined, of course, as opposed to arable land that's located within the walls. Zeru is measured according to the amount of seed grain that the land in question requires, and it's thus explicitly defined and valued according to its productive capabilities. The land of this Euphrates gift estate, therefore, is carefully singled out by the Babylonians as being both productive and heritable. Several concerns lie behind this language, I think. The repeated inclusion of the perpetuity clause suggests an anxiety to encode within the language of the grant the idea of inalienable ownership, as opposed to simply rights of possession or use. It's commonly understood that the Euphrates gift estate is the same as the one that's mentioned in this Babylonian astronomical diaries text for Seleukid year 38, in which something is done to lands given previously by Antiochus I to Babylon, Borsippa, and Cutha. As is often the case for these astronomical diaries, the really important and interesting bits are not clear in the text. So I've given you the Saxon-Hunger translation, then I've given you Van der Speck's translation that has sort of his own filling in of the bits that are missing. So per his translation, the text says, that month, the satrap of Babylonia made the fields which had been given in year 32 at the command of the king for the sustenance of the Babylonians, the Borsippaeans, and the Cuthaeans, and the bulls and the sheep and everything which had been given to the cities and cult centers at the command of the king at the disposal of the citizens. He made it maybe taxable or confiscated property of, in some way, the royal treasury. Now, this is definitely a little bit speculative, but because these lacunae make it sort of impossible to know exactly what Antiochus is really doing to the land. But I do think that we have to take the context of the First Syrian War into our interpretation of this text. And I think that historical context does make Van der Speck's suggestion that this land confiscation has to do with some sort of war tax kind of thing rather likely. And should that be the case, in the Lehman Text, we then see Laodicea returning the land to the cities and righting a wrong done to their agricultural holdings by the previous king. The emphasis placed on this land as productive, used for sustenance, and held in perpetuity makes light, right? And makes sense in the light of such a previous transgression on the city's agricultural property. It's surely worth noting here, I think, as an aside, that it is Laodicea herself, rather than the king, who returns the land to the Babylonian cities. She acts as a benefactor on behalf of the dynasty, not just contributing to the stability of Seleucid power in the region, but also acting to ensure the long-term prosperity of the cities and their inhabitants. It's recently been suggested that the land in question in the Lehman Text may reflect attempts by the Seleucids to increase the amount of arable, productive land in the region of Babylon and Borsippa. According to land surveys, despite the urban conglomerations of Babylon and Borsippa, the areas surrounding these cities were less intensively settled than the floodplains of the northern central Euphrates. As we know, both Babylon and Borsippa were located in marshlands. Around Borsippa, the wetlands were enough of a problem to interfere with Alexander when he returned from the east to the region in 323. In Babylonia, the presence or absence of water was inextricably linked to economic and political survival, with cities and populations rising and falling according to the fluctuations of the water levels in the rivers and the canals. The Seleucids had not neglected to pay close attention to the power vested in the control of water, intensifying the irrigation works around Babylon and Borsippa, as well as in heavily canalized regions, such as those around Uruk. That Laodicea and her sons were able to grant to the cities of Babylon, Borsippa, and Cutha what must have been a substantial estate along the banks of the Euphrates, and that such careful attention should be given to defining this estate as arable, productive land, suggests a desire by the Seleucids to draw attention to their investment in and control over agriculture in the region. Intensive canalization is, of course, to be found throughout the empire. This is one of the stamps of colonialism, I think, for the Seleucid period. From the lower Diyala Plain near Seleucia on the Tigris to the irrigation channels off the Kokcha River above Ai-Khanum, to the canals around the former Achaemenid city of Susa, which has been renamed as Seleucia on the Ulaios, to the Amak Valley near Antioch by Daphne. There are tons of examples, all generally connected, of course, with significant Seleucid urban sites. But the significant changes are not all urban. Archaeological data from northern Mesopotamia indicates the abandonment of large-scale networks of Assyrian period canals in the Erbil Plain. So what had once been intensely exploited land was partially abandoned in the Seleucid era, with settlement increasing instead in the south and southeast of the plain, suggesting an increased exploitation of what had been marginal lands, a deliberate ruralization of what had once been a political and economic core of the region. Now, there are ecological factors at play in this kind of action, such as increasing salinization of the soil, which may play a role in this kind of shift in settlement. But the move to marginal lands may also reflect changing demographics due to Seleucid colonization and the influx of new settlers, pushing the local populations to increasingly peripheral regions. And a while ago, Pierre Briant had proposed a model in which the lands closest to a colonial foundation, such as Antioch, or in this case, Seleucia on the Tigris, would be divided into kleroi, while the remaining more marginal lands would remain in the hands of the earlier inhabitants, physically reinforcing on the land a cultural and economic difference between populations. And this is something I do need to explore further, but I think this is a really interesting way of conceptualizing the Seleucid use of the space and the sort of physical imposition of colonial structures. So ancient sources are pretty much silent on Seleukid use of canals and waterways. I think Mariah probably shares my frustration in all of this. But we do know that by the 2nd century BC, Polybius could claim that the Euphrates no longer emptied into the Persian Gulf, that its water was drawn away by the canals woven across its floodplain long before the river could ever reach the sea. We know that Alexander had employed some 10,000 men for a space of 3 months to clean and improve a long southward flowing canal on the west side of the Euphrates, which is a fairly significant allocation of men and time for a king who's often accused of having no interest at all in infrastructure, right? But the Seleucids, of course, had gone several steps further, restoring and enhancing the waterways of much of Babylonia. And in so doing, had connected the region's profitability to the guarantee of Seleucid power and eternity. So this Euphrates gift estate would remain in the hands of the cities of Babylon, Borsippa, and Cutha, and would presumably remain productive as long as the Seleucids retained their authority in the region, which is to say, in perpetuity, anno unsatu. Prosperity remained a gift of Seleucid continuity. These hydrological changes in Babylonia, as a result of Seleucid colonialism and infrastructure, had impacts beyond simply increasing productivity of the land. The canals would have served to connect communities and encourage organization to manage and maintain water resources, agricultural resources. It's noteworthy that this Euphrates estate is gifted to 3 cities, Babylon, Borsippa, and Cutha, together as one sort of administrative or economic unit. Now, whether this actually implies that the 3 cities were economically linked, as has been suggested, or whether it simply relates to the location of the grant, choosing to unite these 3 cities for the purpose of this grant suggests a desire to increase connectivity, whether this is to generate cooperation for the purposes of resource control, or perhaps to have the effect of increasing competition between the 3 cities over control of this area as a means of kind of managing political control of the region. Hard to say. I'm still thinking about that, I guess. But certainly in this gift estate, careful provision is made to ensure that the Babylonians, and the Babylonians are hugely privileged in this text above the other 2 cities, that the Babylonians currently or previously occupying house plots on the Euphrates estate should retain them in perpetuity. And also any plots that they may have given, that members of the assembly may have given, or by troops, maybe clerics. These are also carefully singled out for protection in perpetuity. Demographic anxieties could possibly lay behind this pointed protection of existing land claims. Certainly the Babylonians had reasons to be a little bit cautious about their claims to land. And certainly Seleucid colonization had resulted in an astonishing demographic explosion, leading to and fed by a rapid intensification of agriculture and irrigation that completely reshaped previous Achaemenid and Bronze Age patterns of living and created a ripple effect throughout the inhabited landscape. The forceful transfer of populations to benefit new colonial urban structures, the redistribution of rural lands, and the construction of major irrigation channels using, presumably, the labor of the region, are all marks of what Paul Kosmin has referred to as the deliberate interventions of willful sovereignty, a brutal break with the patterns of the past. In Babylon, of course, this would have been keenly felt with the construction of Seleucia on the Tigris, and Babylon's sort of complex relationship with this new city. The guarantee of the economic benefits from the Euphrates estate remains significant enough to the Babylonians for the text to have been reinscribed in the late 170s BCE in the reign of Antiochus IV, who had himself a lot of interests in reinforcing his relationship with the cities and inhabitants of this region. So we have this reinscription of the text by the temple scribes of Esagil, perhaps in an attempt to reassert the claims of Babylonian elites to both land ownership and rights of distribution. So to close, I feel like I've just sped through that. The Seleucid Empire remained in a constant state of self-actualization, reified by continual, repeated mobility on roads and waterways, by the co-option and often the deliberate public destruction of marks of previous imperial structures, whether this is Achaemenid roads and cities or Neo-Assyrian canals. For an empire with porous, ambiguous borders, defined by conflict, internal cohesion relied on strengthening the ties that bound people and places. Relationships with cities remained at the heart of this ruling strategy, but just as no man is an island, no city exists in a vacuum. It's only to be expected that the growth and emphasis of cities across the empire would have a ripple effect on their environments, transforming once marginal areas and intensifying conflict between far-flung communities. Thank you. Let me see if I can figure out how to unshare my screen, hopefully.
Thank you very much, Deirdre. I enjoyed your presentation a lot, and I now pass on the floor to Paul for his comments.
Sure. Can you hear me?
There we go.
Yes.
Okay, great. I want to thank both our presenters for sharing their important contributions with us today. Their papers really stand by themselves, and I'm more interested in hearing the broader discussion among everyone present. But Altay and Ben have asked me to offer a brief response, so I've just got a couple of questions. Both papers, in their own distinct ways, challenge us to interrogate our long-established or more recently proposed interpretations about Seleucid territoriality. For Mariah Lord, the debatable salience of political borders, and for Deirdre Klokow, the undoubted overdominance of urbanism in our understanding of the imperial landscape. The papers operate at very different granularities. The first is a kind of helicopter view think piece, and the second building from a close treatment of two particular documents. So I'll offer a few thoughts for each at kind of the scale appropriate to that paper. So to begin with the first paper, Mariah Lord strongly argues the case that a scholarly concentration on the political borders of an ancient state commits one of our discipline's most serious sins, that is historical anachronism. The Seleucid border does not and did not exist, she says. If border means an actually instantiated, physically concrete, continuous line that demarcates a political edge, I think that's incontestable, and I would agree with her absolutely. I'm reminded of George Eliot's instructions for making a cannon. First find a round hole, then enclose it with iron. Lord is undoubtedly correct that a property like spatial imagination, the tidy fencing off of inside from outside, is inadequate to the messy archipelagic nature of Seleucid territory. Her identification of the need, for the sake of our own scholarly hermeneutic of nuanced distinctions between border, frontier, limes, and related terms, is salutary and one I'll certainly take to heart, even if I suspect such clarity may not have obtained in antiquity. The refocusing of attention to the experience of local populations is important and much overdue, and there's plenty in this paper I would agree with. In place of a system of borders, Lord argues two things. First, that Seleucid territory was conceived primarily as a series of spaces through which people moved, and particularly on the basis of the royal titles in the Borsippa cylinder. As an example, that Seleucid kings recognized no earthly boundaries. The paper is fascinating. It raises a number of important issues and introduces fresh arguments, which I hope will be discussed among us all. For my part, I think it might be more productive to zoom away from the specific claims, where I suspect Mariah and I might disagree on a number of interpretations, and raise two larger methodological questions. First, the paper's thesis depends on a contrast between, on the one hand, an ancient world of territorial states with at best only fuzzy frontiers, and on the other, a modern, perhaps Westphalian international system of tidy, clearly demarcated sovereignties. I want to ask, is there in fact an absolute contrast here? The discussions of Brexit, illegal immigration, build the wall politics, and other contemporary pathologies that Lord so helpfully incorporates into her treatment, at the same time suggests that even if the disciplinary and surveillance capacity of the modern states far exceeds anything before modernity, the border remains at heart a political project and not a thing. That is, border as a verb and not a noun. The work of a number of modern historians, perhaps most prominently Lauren Benton, has disclosed the territoriality of the modern state that is far closer to what we see in antiquity. She emphasizes that an understanding of 17th, 18th, and 19th century political territoriality as disaggregated, uneven configurations of corridors, enclaves, overlapping legal systems, spaces of exemption, zones of lawlessness, experiments encounter sovereignty, and so forth. So I wonder if there is, alongside the very real danger of methodological anachronism, a parallel one of anti-anachronism. That's to say, do we have, instead of a qualitative contrast of ancient and modern states, rather, as it were, only a quantitative difference within a common project of statecraft characterized by territorial aspiration? I'll quote briefly from Seth Richardson's wonderful 2012 Past and Present article, Early Mesopotamia, the Presumptive State, in which he argues, and I quote, early states were incomplete, less than the sum of their attributes. Mesopotamian polities were more aspirational than operational in their geographic, legal, and communitarian sovereignty. Notwithstanding, their aspirations to sovereignty were very real from a remarkably early stage, even though state powers remained incipient and unaccomplished for millennia. We have here, in Richardson's view, a model of ancient statecraft as characterized by the simultaneity of inability and desire. So I would agree absolutely with Lord's claim that the search for an instantiated line is a futility. But I wonder whether it makes sense for the Seleucid as for other polities, at least in certain configurations and at particular conditions, to think not so much of line as an object of historical analysis, but rather the desire for line. My second question to Mariah, Lord quite rightly draws our attention to the appearance of royal titles that project universal rule in the Borsippa cylinder of Antiochus I. And she takes this as evidence that, I quote, the Seleucid kings recognized no earthly boundaries. My question, and I think it's a real problem I wrestle with, is how are we to reconcile such statements of universal rule, of unboundedness, statements that are, it has to be said, remarkably rare even within the Babylonian record, and especially in contrast to previous regimes? How are we to reconcile these with a political order that, not only as part of its day-to-day real-world functioning, but even in its most ideology-saturated representations, understood itself as one kingdom among many? Things like diplomatic agreements, dynastic marriages, warfare, trade, and other Babylonian rituals that that acknowledge limitations on territory. It's a really difficult problem. There seem to be two basic options. The first, adopted by Lord, is to take these royal titles literally as statements of the imperial world view. Antiochus I is king of the world. And this requires, as Lord suggests, that we accept the paradox of multiple, incommensurable geographic imagination. There's something to be said for this capacity to contain multitudes, although I do wonder if invoking paradox allows us to avoid pressing the conundrum. How did these imaginations interact? What friction was generated between them? And when did heat from that friction rise to something worthy of historical analysis? That's to say, what is the ecosystem of territorial ideas? But I also wonder, are we at risk of reading royal self-presentation too literally? For the second option is to distinguish between the locutionary content of such statements and the illocutionary act. That's to say, to distinguish between what the Babylonian scribe wrote, and he clearly wrote, Shah Kishati, king of the world, and what he was doing when he wrote this. To offer a comparison from the sublime descending to the ridiculous, I haven't watched football for about 18 years, but maybe because I've been distanced from the UK for so long during the pandemic, I got caught up in the Euros. And I presume at some point soon, because the English football team got further than normal, Coach Gareth Southgate will be awarded a CBE, Commander of the British Empire, in a highly formalized ceremony at Buckingham Palace. A literal reading of this title would, I think, fall very far off from its real function. A ranked honor system that conveys a sense of British heritage embedded in a grander past. So to what extent is the Borsippa cylinder's employment of Neo-Babylonian, Assyrian, and earlier titles, in fact, not a way of saying King Antiochus I rules the world, but rather, or also a way of saying that Antiochus I is acting as an appropriate Mesopotamian king? To what extent are these titles bound to the ritual of renewing the temple without spilling beyond? Is there space for a certain estrangement or even sense of anachronism in these reality-defying titles? I'd be very interested to hear Mariah Lord's thoughts on these questions. Moving on to Deirdre Klokow's paper, So do both together and then here open up to discussion. This paper makes a very different kind of intervention, seeking to redirect our attention away from the urbanism that has so dominated Seleucid scholarship, that is, city as colonial settlement, a seat of political and economic power, as location and catalyst of cultural change, as defensive node. And instead, Klokow pulls to the surface the much overlooked Seleucid engagement with a rural landscape and its agricultural workforce. Klokow achieves this corrective by a very subtle treatment of two documentary sources, both well known, but very rarely juxtaposed. The Lehman Text, we all saw it, a cuneiform clay tablet in which Queen Laodicea and her sons grant or regrant agricultural land along the Euphrates in perpetuity to the cities of Babylon, Borsippa, and Kuta, and the dossier relating to the same queen's purchase of an estate in Hellespontine, Phrygia, OGIS 225. This is an interrogation of interstitial imperial space, the connective tissue of empire between centers of political gravity. No city is an island, as Klokow demonstrates, reinforcing a persuasive model of successful Seleucid rule as the accumulation of contact points between the imperial apparatus and various local populations. Internal cohesion relied on strengthening the ties that bound people and places, she said. I find this all very persuasive, subtly argued, and important, and it raises for me three sets of questions. First, comparison, horizontal and vertical. The comparison of these two documents, dealing with Queen Laodicea and the productive countryside, is irresistible. But in their juxtaposition, I cannot decide whether we should be more surprised by their similarities or their differences. On the one hand, the encouragement to dehomogenize the Hellenistic world is virtually a refrain of current scholarship, and there are obvious distinctions at work here between rain-fed and irrigation agriculture, with their necessarily different positionings to the central state, between a disputed imperial frontier with publication of the dossier also outside of the empire on Samothrace. It's completely fascinating. And versus a securely held imperial heartland, between benefaction and purchase, and between the languages of documentation and all that follows. And yet, as Klokow indicates, despite these bottomless distinctions of location, so much is in common, from the appearance of local workers to the publication clauses obliging monumentalization in sanctuaries to the imperial surveying of the terrain. So I ask, how regionally variable would Seleucid imperial interactions be with different kinds of rural landscape? How granular their control, how legible to governmental knowledge systems? Turning to sort of a vertical diachronic comparison, where does Seleucid government sit within the long history of rural landscape? How much is new or different? Should we imagine, a la Brodel, a different rhythm of historical response to imperial domination than we see in cities? In short, is there such a thing as a distinctly Seleucid rural landscape? And following from this, I'd be tempted to ask sort of a second set of questions. To what extent does this history of rural spaces in fact remain a history of urbanity? Can we escape the city as the organizing principle? Chris Roosevelt's recent treatment of the agricultural landscape of Lydia in the long 3rd century, from Alexander's conquest to the Treaty of Apamea, concluded that behind a general impression of rural continuity, stability of settlements, cult locations, the same crops being grown, and so on, the primary effect of Hellenistic rule was the tighter institutional integration of all countryside activities within civic and royal administrative systems. Does this hold for other agricultural regions? I'm very intrigued by two of the suggestions Klokow raises in the paper relating to the Lehman Text. First, the combining of Babylon, Borsippa, and Kuta as recipients of the land grant. This represents, to my knowledge, an unprecedented urban triad of these cities in the long history of Mesopotamia, even if Kuta is only 25 miles northeast and Borsippa 10 miles southwest of Babylon. Does this represent a rural version of the kind of rationalization of landscape that we see in urban Sinoicism in the Aegean? Second, does the reinscription of this tablet in 170, or in the late 170s, have anything to do with a possible reorganization of Babylon as a polis or politeuma at this very time, with consequent possible redistribution of lands? To what extent is it a defensive document? Third, and most briefly, I'm struck by the rhetoricity of these land grants, especially the temporal rhetoricity, as so clearly brought out by Klokow. The perpetuity clause, anna satu, forevermore to distant days, reminds me slightly of the King of the World in the Borse per Cylinder. In Hellespontine Phrygia, in the ploughed-up ancient royal road, we have confrontation with a passing away of an imperial dispensation. Here we have the anxious projection of imperial eternity and unchanging land ownership. What does in perpetuity really mean? I'm reminded of an article in the New York Times from a couple of years ago, which discussed Leon Levy's and Shelby White's gift to the Metropolitan Museum. In exchange for their benefaction, the Hall of Roman Sculptures would bear their name, quote, in perpetuity. It turns out that for the Met, in perpetuity meant 50 years, and that this was extended to 75 years on negotiation. Urban life has attracted a lot of attention as a political and social locus of futurity. What is the future horizon of imperial rural space? I should wrap up here. As I said, I'm much more interested in hearing other voices and turn this back to our speakers and other participants. But I really do want to congratulate both scholars for their exciting work. The papers beautifully complemented each other, both in scale and methodology. And it's really thrilling to see such important work being produced. For the first, the overcoming of academic boundaries, and for the second, the tilling of new ground. And so I very much look forward to seeing where these projects go.
Thank you so much, dear Paul, for these very kind, constructive, and helpful words. I'm sure that they will give a lot to think about to our speakers and to all of us. I would now suggest that first Mariah has a chance to respond, and then Deirdre. And I now confess, out of the moment, it may not have been ideal how we have organized the whole session. It would have been wonderful to see actually a spin between you and each of the speakers, something we cannot afford in the time frame of the 2 hours that we have today. So after the two speakers will have given their response, we will then open the floor to questions and discussions. And for those who want, we might even go a little bit beyond the 2 hours. We shall see how that works. Now, Mariah, please.
Oh, so firstly, thank you very much for being so kind as well about my paper. Yeah, two very good questions, I must admit. To deal with the first one, if there is truly a real contrast going on here. I like this idea that this is a project, not a thing, as it were, if I can paraphrase it like that. That it's an idea, an aspiration to have a border. Now, I think that yes, I could definitely see that, and definitely see that at an elite level in terms of a project. Maybe I should explain a little bit more. When I first conceived of this approach, it was because I wanted to, I don't really like the phrase, but I wanted to try and excavate a history from below. And I wondered if this was an area in which it might be possible to start excavating some of those views from below, to deal with space rather than to see, yeah, this larger, I think I used the word meta, sort of sense of scale and delineation there. So yes, I would definitely take that on board. I could see that that would be very much how that could be perceived at a certain level. But looking at the, there's a nice, I think it's Sherwin Wright or somebody, it says, when you look at the Achaemenid Empire from below, or maybe it's Pierre Briand, when you look at the Achaemenid Empire from below, it disappears. And it was that sense that I should perhaps have, I had to cut this back because it was over long, and I should probably have kept that in there, actually. It would have been better. So that would be maybe this is how I would see the thesis going. So it was a history from below approach, more than a history from above. But I should have made that more explicit. You're quite right. As for the second point, between it being literal or too literal, and I love the idea of the Borsipper cylinder as being a CBE. Yeah. Absolutely, that makes perfect sense to me. But I do think that I think I would follow John Marr in this. I would like to embrace paradox within the Hellenistic world. So I would see this as lots and lots of competing levels, and the level that I'm interested in is that one at the bottom. And hopefully, as the project develops, that's where it will become more obvious that I'm trying to see everything from not from the top but from underneath, and possibly that will help me get around that paradox that, yeah, absolutely, it's a very, very fair comment in there, and I'll have to go away and think about that some more. But thank you very much. That's incredibly useful. Yeah.
Thank you, Mariah. And now Deirdre, please.
Okay, thank you, Paul, for that, for everything you had to say. I feel like I need to go away and think about it for about a week before I have anything very intelligent to say about it. But I do just want to respond briefly to some of what you said. And one of the things that really interested me in juxtaposing these two texts is that there's so much to say concerning similarity and difference in these texts, in these two regions. I love the distinction between rain-fed and irrigated agriculture. This plays a big role in my dissertation, and is something that I think bears a lot of further thinking about the way that this is impacting the development of Seleucid bureaucracy, right? I mean, what are the kinds of imperial reactions to the changes in the kind of structure that you need in these two kinds of disparate territories? And of course, Asia Minor, in some senses, stands on its own in a way that Mesopotamia and Babylon does not. It's a sort of separate limb almost of the Seleucids, and because of so much external pressure, I mean, not that the Seleucids are lacking external pressure in other places, but the specific kinds of external pressure and competition that you see happening in Asia Minor, I think it's really interesting to be able to see that despite these differences, political differences, environmental differences, we still see the bureaucracy operating in a kind of similar way. And I think we often think of the Seleucids as being sort of ideologically developed rather than administratively developed. So often described as being much like the Achaemenids, kind of thin on the ground. But I think that these texts offer us a glimpse of the way that the Seleucids are really trying to reach for a sense of cohesion in the way that they're treating disparate territories and bringing it together. Which brings me to your sort of second point about whether or not we can really define or understand a Seleucid understanding of rural spaces. I mean, this is kind of the question that's at the heart of my dissertation, right? So I feel like after a year of dissertating in the middle of a pandemic and nothing to do but read, I wish I had a better answer to this question. But I guess you'll have to stay tuned for my dissertation. But also, I think it depends on what we really understand the administration as being and doing. I think especially living in the US over the past couple of years, I've become very interested in trying to understand what the difference is in being a citizen of a state and then the sort of elite 1%, right? There are big, big differences. And the nature of administration does not always reflect the lived experience of a citizen, thank God. So I'm interested in the way that this plays out in the Seleucid space, which is why I sort of jumped at this chance to look at the interventions of local inhabitants. I think we look at the Seleucids and ancient empires in general from such a top-down perspective, and like Mariah, I really want to reconstruct a ground-up understanding of these rural spaces. So that's a function of my dissertation, but also of this GIS mapping project that I'm dabbling in currently, because I think that, or I hope, I guess, that a visual reconstruction of bureaucracy, and especially the movement of bureaucracy through rural spaces, will help us to sort of gain a more vivid or a more real understanding of this conception of rurality. Because I think the texts alone don't give us really enough there, but I'm hoping that with a better understanding of agricultural use, a better understanding of local populations and demographies, and a better understanding of coinage, especially local bronze coinage and its movements, that I'll be able to have a more sensible answer to these questions in the future. But again, thank you so much. It was great to see you and great to hear what you have to say. It's always incredibly intellectually generative for me to talk to you. So thank you.
So thanks to all of you, and we would now take questions or comments from the floor. You can either raise your hand physically, and if you have a camera on, I can see that, or you can use the raise hand function, which I think is you can use from either the bottom. That these are the no. Probably you have to go into the participants list, and there then should be the raise hand function. Yes, I see it. If you click your name on the participants list, there is a hand you can raise. So either way works fine. While you are still considering how to phrase your question or your comment, lest to waste time, I am throwing one question at Mariah. Mariah, your distinction between lines as elite, court perspective, and space as a local perspective is on the one hand very simplistic, but it's on the other hand very stimulating. I've never looked at it like that, and it is certainly thought-provoking. However, what do you do with local elites? They can you would you be able to locate them somewhere in your scheme?
Yeah, this is a problem. Yeah, haven't really worked out what to do with those yet, to be honest. Well, that's a very good question. I still think that local elites are not necessarily who I'm interested in, I think, generally speaking. However, they may be some of the only ways into this, looking at the sources, I think. So I was very taken by, there's a chapter in the Cuneiform Culture book by Baker about seeing the spaces of Babylon by moving through them, and how you would excavate people's experience of that. And it's not the experience of the priestly caste or any of the elite there, but it's actually of the people moving through their spaces and seeing how they would perceive them. So I was going to try and avoid them as much as possible, but I think I may not be able to. And I really haven't quite worked out how that either contributes to or undermines my perspective, to be honest. But it's a very good question.
Thank you. Well, yeah, we are not gathering today to find answers to all questions, but if there is something to work on in the future, that's wonderful. So I have three people wanting to contribute. I start with Céline Desbourses.
Hi, and thank you both for your wonderful papers. I have a question for Deirdre Klokow. It's regarding the Babylon versus Paquita thing in the Lehman Text, which is actually not at all that unique, not even sort of to this text, and certainly also not to this period. We already see it in the Babylonian times, but it does become much more prominent in the Hellenistic period. and it is much more visible in cultic texts. So there's a very strong cultic relation between these temples, and we see this in the movement of gods and ritual, personal, and even name-giving patterns. And I do think that there's indeed like a socioeconomic background to this, but that it's rather older, so it certainly predates the Hellenistic period, and I don't think it's superimposed by Seleucid rulers. Although I do find your suggestion pretty interesting that it might have to do with creating competition. My question is if you see this elsewhere, something that pre-exists and is then used in this way.
Thank you. Yes, you're completely right. I think the association between these cities does go back, I think, to Neo-Babylonian times. I confess to not being that well read in cultic texts, which I definitely need to take a closer look at. So thank you for that. As far as whether this is something I see in other places, do you mean the association of cities as an administrative district, or I'm not quite sure.
Yeah, so that there is already a pre-existing relationship between certain cities and their institutions, and that this is then reinforced under Seleucid rule.
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think oftentimes we see the Seleucids operating in pre-existing administrative space and units, despite their total lack of willingness to sort of acknowledge Achaemenid and pre-existing imperial structures in any kind of verbal way or written way. They're clearly very happy to move in and sort of co-opt pre-existing administrative structures. I think what's interesting in Babylon and Borsippa to me is what you're stressing, this kind of religious component also, that these are major shrines, major temple sites that are connected, not just administratively or in terms of economic function, but they have a sort of religious continuity. And this to me is something that's maybe unique to Babylon and to this area. So it's something I really want to look at further. So it's a really great question. Thank you.
Thank you. And the next question will come from Stephen Harrison.
Awesome. Thanks, folks. And thanks, Altay, for correcting the fact that I can't type my own name, apparently. That's twice in a row I've come to these, and I've been so frantically trying to get in on the dot, I've misspelled my own name. So thanks for correcting that. Yeah, so I've got a question in here, but it might be a comment to get to the question. But basically, Maria, I agree with you 100%, and Paul, I agree with you 100%. And that's the problem, right? That there's a paradox about how we deal with this notion of universalism and this notion of boundaries. And I guess between you kind of posed the question, how do we resolve that? And I wonder if my response is to say, well, do we need to? Is it possible that notions of universalism and notions of bounded territory can coexist perfectly happily within the same kind of spectrum? And I think, one way of resolving it is, I guess, to go down the line of saying the universalism is an ideological construct, and then you get the practical recognition of things like marriages and interstate treaties and things like that. But I think there's perhaps a question there about what we mean by ideology and what's it for? Why do states want to be universalist, for example? And some of the work that people like Peter Ban have done on this argue that universalism is a way to unite disparate territories and bring people together. And I wonder if there's an ideological component to notions of borders as well, that, if you're living on, I'm not thinking about a line in the sand border, but on a contact zone or a transitional zone, being part of a territory versus not being part of a territory can contribute to identity. And I just wonder if sometimes when we're talking about Seleucid ideology, we want to talk about Seleucid ideology, and we ask the question, what is Seleucid ideology? And the answer might be, well, it depends on who you ask. And it might be that we need to stop saying Seleucid ideology and talk about Seleucid ideologies. So that's my thought. Do you, to what extent do you think these things actually can coexist? I think is the question. Yeah.
Mariah, would you like to?
Yeah, so I'll go with that. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. I think they can coexist. I think certainly on the level of sort of academic discourse, definitely we can see it in all sorts of different ways, and I don't have a problem with that. I'm quite happy to deal with multiple perspectives and have them all being as valid as each other. I think there is a difference when it comes to excavating lived experience, and that I think is a slightly different thing. I think people's lived experience on the ground actually, and prizing that out of the sources, and of course the sources are largely not going to be written at this point. We're going to have to deal with space as we excavate it, archaeological artifacts and coinage and all the other things that actually Deirdre talked about. But people's lived experiences of those zones where we might see overlapping cultures or conflict zones or something like that, how we excavate that is problematic, but at the same time it will give us something concrete. I think there's something, I would argue that there's something concrete in the lived experience, and one of the directions I'm keen to explore is the idea of this sort of sensory approach. This comes from sensory archaeology. How do we experience the spaces that we're in? And how do we use material culture, particularly, in order to help us do that? So I think there might be a difference between a sort of an ideological, a sort of an abstract discussion of that, and actually the concrete, practical sense of being on the ground. And for the purposes of my project, that's very much what I'm interested in. But yes, I have no problem with those paradoxes and those different layers, I would say.
Thank you. And the next question will be asked by Jean Kurt.
Thank you for the both very exciting lectures. I would have a question for Mariah Lord. The phenomenon you described reminds me a lot of the concept imperium sine fine from the Augustan era. And here too we can observe that consciously borders were not firmly defined. For example, we have Parthia, where we can see that client state could belong both to Rome or Parthia, and that was not a problem for both empires. And so I'm asking myself, do we find maybe a very similar phenomenon here in the Seleucid Empire? And could this phenomenon maybe a template for Augustus or other emperors like maybe Nero, the Armenian policy? So I would be interested in this point.
I think that's an excellent observation. I think you're right. That might actually be, I think that happens in Bactria in the East, definitely. I think we could definitely point to a very similar situation. As for that being a template, I think that would be something to follow up. I have, unfortunately, very little expertise in the Roman world, so, but I will look into that, I think. But I think you're right, this sort of the sense that people are, maybe some places are very good at playing it both ways and sitting in the middle. And I'm almost sure that, that in places like Bactria and things, that is absolutely key to what's going on at certain points as well. But it's very, whether that, and Armenia as well. And I think that was probably true in the Achaemenid period as well. Armenia has that sort of slightly in, slightly out sense going on as well. So, a very interesting point. It's something I'm going to take 4 different spaces, I think, and Bactria, Iconium and the area around there is going to be one of them to sort of test drive some of these. So I think that comment is very helpful.
We have another. Thank you. We have another question by Kishen.
Okay. So you guys can hear me, right?
Yes.
Okay, great. Awesome. So yeah, so I have a question for you. So I also work on administrative and economic side of this Seleucid Empire, and also in exam. So your presentation was very incredibly illuminating. Makes me feel like I'm, so thank you. That's great. So so my my question is more on Laodicea's land ownership. Does the evidence that you have in the study shows that she has like a very clear type of land ownership? She has like different types of land ownership. Because from the evidence, from the inscription which you listed in the presentation, it's a land grant from Antiochus II to her as a settlement. Whether it's a divorce or not, that's still kind of under debate. So there's a one sentence in that inscription which is between line 31 and 2, right? And the Greek says, the hoi parhautais periamenoi e lambontes autoide hexus in curios, right? Those who buying and receiving the land from her will hold it like in a manner of a curios, and this curios with omega, right, is average. So and that the phrase, because I also come across with this piece for my own project that I'm writing, is the idea of curia, right? And are we talking about a political idea or economic idea? Or if it's an economic idea, then does it refer to the Greek idea of kuria, which mean more like a stewardship, not an ownership of a piece of property, right? So in the Greek marriage law, for example, the husband will be the kurios of his spouse property. And is this type of economic idea being transplanted on Hellenistic government, right? And that's the question that I'm asking. If this, because Laodicea's father, Archias, right, and he in another piece testified as of a couples in the Asia, right? And from what it describes, seems like the local population has ecclesia, which is pretty much empowers to govern like by by itself. It is a sort of a local resident body that's able to grant benefits to their curios. So he's not owning politically. So if it's not political ownership, and it refers to some kind of like economic stewardship. So is this kind of stewardship that we also see in Laodicea's land ownership? Or do we see like two types of land ownership in Asia Minor or in Babylon?
Thank you. That's a great question. It's a huge question. I think I'm just going to give a brief answer here because I think the short answer is that I'm not completely sure. I think that there are a couple of things to really consider when we consider the nature of land ownership in this text with Laodicea. One of the things that I'm very interested in is this idea of female land ownership, right? Is there some kind of a distinction going on here? And a lot of scholarship on the text has kind of danced over it or made this text seem kind of like an extraordinary sale of land to a female owner, right? But we do get the sense from the text that Laodicea has her own sort of administrative structure in place. She has a steward, she has all of this set up to receive this land and deal with it. So in that sense, I think we're dealing with something that is not unique, that is a widespread practice of land ownership. Now, whether this is a kind of stewardship or what exactly this kind of land ownership means, I'm still not totally sure. I'm inclined to think that we're looking at an economic practice and not a political practice. But I think that that's something that deserves a much more detailed examination and comparison than I'm really prepared to give right now. But I'd love to know, if you have thoughts yourself, because it sounds like we're dealing with very similar areas of interest. So I'd love to know what you think or what anybody else thinks, because these are really big questions. And oftentimes these questions of the nature of these economic institutions are something that I feel like we could argue about for hours, right? There's so many ways to come down on either side of these questions. So that's my sort of non-answer to the question. But I'd love to hear if anyone else has an answer.
So
like if it's,
I think since we have reached the end of our time, I would say this is not a period, not a full stop of our conversation and discussion, but rather call it a semicolon. Truly, the intention of the Seleucid study days, as much as this of this Seleucid lecture, is to foster discussion and exchange as ongoing. So a lot of the discussion hopefully will continue via email, via other venues, and I can easily share the list of questions and comments that I still have later on. And I would encourage all of you to do the same. The two speakers have generously shared their emails with us on the abstracts that are online. So if you have something to communicate, you can do it directly with the speakers, or you can also send stuff to Ben and me, and we will happily share it, communicate it, and we're always happy to be part of these well, developing ideas. I pass on the word to Ben for some concluding remarks.
No, I just wanted, oh, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I don't have in front of me the August speaker. Could you do that, Altay? It was, we just wanted to do a prospectus.
Oh, okay, yeah. We would like to point to the last lecture in our summer lecture series that will be given by Sylvain and Gerard, who is with us, and also today and in all the other lectures. And she will talk on the Seleucid infantry, cavalry ratios, the importance of numerical evidence for understanding Seleucid warfare. So that will be on August the 18th, always the third Wednesday in a month that we want to occupy as a Seleucid Wednesday. And I'd also like to indicate that we have already enough papers for a fall sequence. And but we are still welcoming paper proposals, which we might either put into the fall or the winter, or possibly into a Seleucid study day that I am envisioning, carefully planning for the next spring, and which might take a hybrid form, partly in the format of this WebEx lecture that we are having, partly with some live presence here at Waterloo. And I see some faces which will hopefully, surely join me here as well. So please don't hesitate if you have ideas, if you are developing a research project as a PhD student, master student, or in whichever capacity, please do share, and we'll be very happy to give you a venue like this. And as we have seen, we have all been learning so much from the ongoing research projects of Mariah and Deirdre. So thank you very much to all of you for your patience. Again, we went a little over time, but let's take this as a compliment to our excellent speakers and also our excellent responder. Thank you very much, Paul, to you in particular as well. Hope to see all of you, as many of you as possible, in a month's time. And please do enjoy the summer. I hope that we'll have a little bit more measured conditions, a little bit less heat in North America, a little bit less humidity and precipitation in Europe. That would be very nice for the rest of the summer. Take care, everyone.
Thank you. Thank you. Mariah, are you still there? Yes.
Hello, yeah, hi.